an IRA.
Required minimum distribution.
Required, normal.
Premature, right?
Early.
distribution.
Yeah, pretty much. So early, normal, and required. And so for the traditional, all distributions are gonna be subject to a federal and state income tax, regardless of age, right? And so with that, the reason why we say we can withhold a minimum of 10 and 1 is because, you know, the tax they're gonna pay on it, federal is gonna be no less than 10, and state is gonna be no less than 1. So obviously, we can't advise them as to how much that's exactly gonna be based on their income and the way they file and all that, but we can just let them know the minimum we can withhold is 10 and 1, and the reason is because they're not gonna get taxed anything less than that. Any questions on that? So the next one, we're gonna go into a little bit more into early distributions. Can somebody tell me why a distribution would be considered early?
If members were short on or wanting extra funds, but it's not within their time frame,
And what is that time frame?
for their required minimum distribution.
No, it's early distribution.
Oh, early, if they're 71 or.
That-
Under 59.5.
Under 59.5, yes. So under 59.5. Do penalties apply to the certificate even if they're just withdrawing?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, they do apply, penalties, and then are there any other penalties that this person would pay for an early distribution? What is it?
Early distribution.
With IRS.
And what is that fee?
15%.
10%.
10%.
And, can anybody tell me if there's any exceptions to this where the person could withdraw, they're younger than 59.5, but they might not be taxed, and like we said last time, we always wanna say might, or may be, or, you know, may not, because we're not tax advisors, so we can't really assure them anything, and we shouldn't be assuring them anything, but can anybody tell me exceptions to that? So a person is, I don't know, 40, and they're looking to withdraw money, and there's certain exceptions that they might not get taxed for this withdrawal. Can somebody tell me what those are? Or
Total
example?
hardship. I see that often, but I don't know if that applies.
I think that's more for 403Bs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Then.
There's certain categories.
Are they buying a home?
Buying a home, that's one.
Oh, okay.
And there's certain limits, I think it's 20,000 that they can do. But that, I'll have to get back on you guys. But yes, there's certain exceptions, so disability, higher education expenses, first time home buyer, beneficiary of a deceased IRA owner or an IRS levy. So those things wouldn't incur the 10% early withdrawal penalty, but once again, we can't really advise members too much on that side. That's just something for you to keep in mind, but they would have to double check with their tax advisor to see if this distribution would qualify as an exception for them. And then we're gonna get into normal distributions. So what would be considered a normal distribution, or can anybody tell me a little bit about that?
After 59.5.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, after the 59.5, would penalties apply if it's in the certificate? If they're doing a normal distribution?
If it's not
I think
premature.
so, yeah.
Yes, so they do apply. And will the IRS charge them and any extra fees for withdrawing as a normal distribution? No fees. And then, as we all know, distributions can be set up to be automatic, and we'll get into forms next meeting and certain transactions, but here we're just gonna talk about the distribution side. Can anybody tell me what R&D stands for?
Required minimum distribution.
Oh, right, and who has to take a required minimum distribution?
Over the age of 70
What is it?
and a half. Over the age of 70 and a half.
Okay,
If you inherit an IRA, you have to take one, don't you?
yes, there's a certain withdrawal. You have to withdraw in a certain period of time, but we'll talk about that probably next meeting, a little bit more into that. But actually, there was changes to that, so 72, and we'll talk a little bit more about and yes, 70 and a half, that still applies, we'll talk about that here in the next slide. Are there any penalties for
No.
withdrawing as an RD? There is an exception where, or there is a certain circumstance where the penalty will apply, the certificate penalty. Can you tell me what that is?
Is it if the term is 5 years or something, like when it's locked in for
No.
a certain amount?
It's
More?
it's the
It's-
amount.
Yeah,
It's less?
Yes.
if it's more than the R&D amount, they're gonna get penalized on that amount.
Yes, so that difference will be, there is penalties that will incur for the certificate if they're withdrawing more than the required minimum distribution, unless obviously if it's during the grace period, then at that point, there's no penalties. Is there a penalty by, IRS? Do they get penalized for withdrawing an R&D?
No.
No penalties, because once again, they're of age, and this is required, so they're not gonna be charged an extra percentage or anything like that for making this withdrawal. And then, can anybody tell me how that amount, the RMD, is determined?
Your life expectancy?
Okay,
Your life expectancy?
so yes, the life expectancy chart and fair market value of the member's IRA. And we're gonna talk a little bit about the timeline. So 70.5 and 72 is something that we were talking about. Can anybody tell me the specific dates? There's certain dates where the cutoff is, depending on the person's birth date, and that's how we know when, well, we'll talk about it, but can anybody tell me that date? Do you guys remember that date?
What date?
So the date where, cause there's a certain date, there was changes, so the RMD used to be at 70.5, now it's at 72. But there's a certain date of their birthday, if the member's birthday was on this day or forward, then it'll determine when they have to take out the RMD. No? Alright, so the first 70.5, so individuals born before July 1st of 1949, who are already age 70.5 or older, are still required to continue to take their RMD. There was changes, so now it's 72, but if their birthday was on this date, or before, then they still have to continue to take that RMD. If their birthday is after that date, they do have to, now with the new rule, they'll have to wait, or they'll start taking RMD until they're 72. You guys have any questions on that? And this is all determined by the IRS, so don't ask me why that date. Cause I wouldn't know the answer to that, but yeah, that's the exact date. Something to think about, you know, with everything, end of the year coming, new year starting, taxes, you know, it's time to do taxes and all that, so we wanna keep all this in mind, you know, during this. So can anybody explain what the equation would be? What's on top and what's on the bottom? I think you mentioned a little bit earlier, so you wanna take a shot at it? So what's on top?
Top one would be life expectancy? No, just kidding. Opposite.
Yes.
Life expectancy on the.
So the fair market value, or, yeah, the life expectancy is the table we use, but you can also think about it as a distribution period. Can anybody explain to me when you hear fair market value, what does that mean? I mean, that's the equation, we use that term, but what does that mean? What does fair market value mean?
What it's at that moment?
Mm-hmm,
Like-
when? So we're talking about the balance of like an IRA. So what would you say the fair market value is? Thinking about like taxes and all that. Not sure?
Not sure.
Can anybody read that for me?
The total of all just traditional IRA shares on December 31st of the previous year.
So the fair market value is just the balance at the end of the previous year. It's just a fancy way to say it, but really it's just the balance of the IRAs that the member or the person has for the previous year. And so we're withdrawing by the distribution period. I kind of already mentioned it. So that's a number that's determined using the IRS life expectancy table that represents the applicable distribution period. So based on the member's age, the IRS determines what that number is, and so you literally just divide that by the balance they had the previous year, and that's how you get the RMD, the required minimum distribution, which is, if you didn't know, you can find that on the IQ tree where it says IRS, or you can go to the DR and you can find the letter that we sent to the member for that year. Do you have any questions on that? Right, no questions? And so now we're gonna get a little bit into the Roth IRA distributions. So when somebody turns 70.5 or 72, depending on their birth date, what would the RMD look like?
I don't think there is an RMD for that.
There is, you're right. So there's no mandatory distribution requirement unless it is a beneficiary or inherited Roth IRA, kind of like Sue was talking about. We'll get a little more into detail with that, but depending on, you know, if it was a beneficiary or inherited IRA, there is a withdrawal period. I believe it's 10 years. You have 10 years to fully withdraw all those funds, and you can do that periodically, or you can do it all at once, a lump sum within those 10 years. And so with Roth IRA distributions, there are qualified and non-qualified distributions, which we'll touch on here. And so a qualified distribution of assets may be taken tax and penalty free. Our favorite words, may be, right? We can't really assure the member, yes, this is gonna be tax and penalty free because we're not tax advisors. All we can say is, you know, you wanna double check with your tax advisor if this will be a qualified or non-qualified distribution. And so we'll get into qualified distribution. So there's two qualifications that have to be met for a distribution from a Roth to be considered qualified. Can somebody tell me one of those? Or it's actually one, and then there's a couple options, but what is the first one?
Is it what Rose said earlier about like the 5 years, having it for at least 5
Yes,
years?
so that's, so she was on that one. So yes, it's a 5-year waiting period, starting from January 1st of the year of the first contribution. And we'll get a little bit more into the forms at the next meeting, but that's why one of those forms asks, has a member had Roth IRA for more than 5 years? Because that will determine, you know, if these are considered qualified distributions and all that, so we'll get a little more into that. And the second factor to that is, so it has to be the 5-year waiting period, and then after age 59 and a half, death, disability, or a first-time home purchase. So the first one has to be met, and then one of the other ones for the distribution to be considered qualified. What questions do you guys have on that? And we're actually at the last slide here. What is a non-qualified distribution? Well, obviously it's not qualified. Distributions did not meet the previous requirements. Can anybody tell me, for a non-qualified distribution, would the person be, you know, subject to the 10% penalty? We're talking about a Roth here.
I would say so, yeah.
Yes, well. And so earnings are subject to federal and state income tax. As we know with Roth IRAs, the earnings may be tax-free, kind of like we said last time, may be, you know, depending on the situation, the type of withdrawal they're doing, all the earnings, you know, and typically that's kind of the benefit. Once they start withdrawing later in, you know, in the future, those earnings will be tax-free or may be tax-free, once again, because certain factors could make it that it might not be tax-free, depending on the distribution type. And then same thing, our certificate penalties apply if not within the maturity period. That's pretty much kind of distributions in a quick little summary of them. Do you guys have any questions, anything that has to do with distributions, or just any questions? I know next meeting we're gonna get a little more into transactions, you know, what they mean, how they're processed, the paperwork, that kind of thing. But do you guys have any questions?
The question that I get a lot from our members is, what's the benefit of locking in a certificate, an IRA certificate for a shorter period of time versus
A long period of
like
time.
a longer period of time? What do you tell your members?
I mean, it kind of depends on the situation. So like, let's say the member already knows and maybe they already consulted with their advisor, maybe they're gonna be withdrawing, maybe for, you know, maybe they're a first-time home buyer and they need the funds, they're planning to buy next year. Then depending on their timing on that, you don't want to put it in or lock it in for a long period of time, because then they'll be subject to the penalties, right? So maybe let's say they say, you know, by the end of next year, I'll be ready to withdraw those funds. So then maybe at that point you'll consider a year, or maybe a month before. That way they have the funds available, they can start withdrawing, that kind of thing. But it's gonna be more depending on, right now with everything going on, there's so much uncertainty. You know, the market's kind of been up and down. We don't know what's gonna happen. We can't predict that. So really, what I tell members now is, you know, with everything going on, there could be changes. Once again, there could be. We don't know if there will be or not. But I always advise members, you wanna make sure that you, maybe right now will be a better opportunity or a better decision to do something short term. Just because, you know, members are always talking about, oh, you know, the rates are so low, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, that's always a perfect conversation that they can have with Christian. Maybe he has something different that he can offer that might earn them a little bit better rate. But also, we don't know how the market's gonna, you know, be going. with everything going on, we might have a new president, we don't, you know, where we stand right now, but all those things change the market, and so rates could very well next year be an all-time high, you know, at what they've been in the last couple of years, so we don't know that. So typically, if members are kind of concerned about rates, I always say, you know, I recommend something short-term, just in case there's changes, and, you know, cause what if rates go up next month? You know, we don't know. And if they're locked in for, you know, 2 years, 3 years, then they'll be subject to penalties.
Yeah.
Unless it was like on error on our end, but that rarely happens.
Yeah.
Good question.
Thank you.
What questions do you guys have? Any other questions?
Wait, do we still waive the, penalty for qualified withdrawals if the term is less than 24 months?
I don't think the term really determines, or it's gonna be based if it's qualified or, but I don't know, that I have to double check if we
I
waive
think
the
it is.
certificate.
There's
We've
like
always
a-
honored that, if
And I
it's
think
under
it's
24
also-
months, I don't know if it went away, but it's written in the disclosure.
I'll
There's
double
a,
check.
I think it's on the penalty
chart.
chart. Yeah, there's a.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Penalty
I'll double
chart.
check on that, but yeah, that I'm not
Yes.
sure.
Sometimes if they're reinvesting it and the check's made payable to them for another investment,
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah, so I have to double check on that
Yeah,
one.
check on that.
Yeah. Any other questions?
What's the penalty if they don't take it out when they're required to? Cause I know there's just like a large penalty.
That's a good question too. I should have probably, I'm not sure, I have to double check for you. So, yeah, but there is a penalty.
Yeah, I think it's like something along the lines of like half of what they were supposed to take out. It's a large chunk, like, it's just,
Yeah.
just come in or have members, you know.
I'll double check on that, so I'll write those questions down there. I'll send an email.
It might be based on their age too and how much income they make.
Possibly, yeah, and I'll double check on that, but I know there is a penalty if they don't take the RMD, but there's also a grace period. Like, okay, maybe you didn't take it, you forgot, whatever, you still have till this date, but I'll double check on that for you.
Just tell members you don't mess with the IRS.
Don't mess with the IRS.
Well, because those
Short
funds
and
are,
Yeah.
those funds are tax deferred,
Yes.
so they can't continue to leave it in there to dodge the tax bullet. So
Exactly.
that's the reason why people would
That's
not
what-
want to take it out, because they don't wanna pay taxes.
Exactly, but with tradition, and once again, they have to, because Uncle Sam wants his money, you know?
Yep.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
No, a lot of good information.
Yeah, so Danny sent me the link for the previous meeting, so I'll be sending that out today, and then once you have the new one, then I'll send that as well,
I remember that.
alright? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, Robert, thank you.